College professor failed the grizzled veteran student until the dean discovered his CIA service record. When 52-year-old Marcus Thompson walked into Professor Helen Morrison's International Relations classroom at Riverside Community College, his weathered face and calloused hands immediately set him apart from the fresh-faced 18-year-olds around him. What nobody knew was that this quiet man in flannel shirts and work boots had spent 23 years protecting American interests in the world's most dangerous places, and was about to teach everyone a lesson about judging books by their covers. The autumn leaves crunched under Marcus Thompson's worn work boots as he made his way across the Riverside Community College campus. At 52, he felt every year of his age as he navigated between clusters of students who seemed young enough to be his grandchildren. His graying beard and the permanent squint lines around his eyes told stories that none of these kids could even imagine. Marcus had enrolled in the International Relations program using his GI Bill benefits, hoping to earn the degree he'd never had time to complete. After 2 decades serving his country in ways he couldn't discuss, he wanted something different, something normal. But normal, he was quickly learning, wasn't as simple as he'd hoped. Professor Helen Morrison's classroom buzzed with the energy of eager students discussing current events. At 38, Dr. Morrison was the department's rising star, fresh from her PhD at Georgetown with a specialty in Middle Eastern politics. Her perfectly pressed blazers and academic credentials commanded immediate respect from both colleagues and students. Today, we'll be discussing the complexities of intelligence gathering in hostile territories, Professor Morrison announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had studied these topics extensively. I expect thoughtful analysis based on our assigned readings. Marcus took his usual seat in the back corner, his large frame barely fitting into the plastic chair designed for traditional college students. He pulled out a well-worn notebook and a cheap pen, the same kind he'd carried through countless briefings in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. Before continuing, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes whose uniforms were never meant to be seen. As the discussion progressed, Marcus listened to his classmates regurgitate textbook theories about insurgency tactics and cultural intelligence. Their answers were polished, academically sound, and completely divorced from reality. When one student suggested that building rapport with local populations is simply a matter of understanding cultural nuances from anthropological studies, Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Thompson," Professor Morrison said, noticing his restlessness, "you seem to have something to add. Please share your thoughts on effective intelligence gathering methodologies." The classroom fell silent. Marcus rarely spoke during discussions, and when he did, his responses were brief and often dismissed by Professor Morrison as overly simplistic. She had already formed her opinion of the older student, a blue-collar worker trying to better himself, but lacking the intellectual sophistication required for serious academic discourse. "Well," Marcus began, his voice gravelly from years of smoking cigarettes in desert outposts, "I think building trust takes more than reading about culture in books. Sometimes you've got to sit in the dust with someone, share their tea, and listen to their stories about their children. Real intelligence comes from understanding that everyone, no matter which side they're on, wants to go home to their family at the end of the day." Professor Morrison's expression tightened. "That's rather simplistic, Mr. Thompson. Intelligence gathering requires systematic analysis, technological resources, and trained operatives. It's not about having tea parties." A few students snickered, and Marcus felt the familiar burn of being underestimated. He'd spent years having his appearance and manner prejudge his capabilities, but in his previous life, that had often been an advantage. Here, it just made him feel invisible in all the wrong ways. "I see," Marcus replied quietly, making a note in his margin. He wouldn't argue. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the other person wasn't ready to hear the truth. Professor Morrison continued her lecture, citing academic papers and theoretical frameworks. Marcus continued taking notes, writing down not just her words, but his own observations about how real-world experience translated or failed to translate into classroom theory. The disconnect was staggering, but he kept his mouth shut. As class ended, Professor Morrison handed back the midterm exams. Marcus waited until the classroom emptied before approaching her desk. His paper bore a large red D at the top. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his frustration. "I answered every question." "Your responses lack academic rigor, Mr. Thompson," Professor Morrison replied without looking up from her gradebook. "This is a college-level course, not a coffee shop discussion. I need scholarly analysis, not personal anecdotes and oversimplified observations." Marcus stared at the grade, thinking of the sacrifices he'd made, the years away from his family, the friends he'd lost, the secrets he'd carried to his grave, all in service of the very subjects she taught from textbooks. "I'll do better," he said simply, folding the paper and walking away. Outside, the autumn air felt sharp against his face. He had 8 weeks left in the semester, and his GPA was already suffering. But Marcus Thompson had faced longer odds in far more dangerous places. He wasn't about to quit now. The fluorescent lights of the community college library hummed overhead as Marcus spread his textbooks across a corner table, the same spot he'd claimed every evening for the past month. Around him, traditional students typed furiously on laptops, their energy fueled by energy drinks and the invincibility of youth. Marcus preferred his yellow legal pad and the methodical scratch of pen on paper, old habits from a career where electronic devices could get you killed. His international relations grade had become a source of constant stress. Despite spending hours reviewing Professor Morrison's assigned readings, his papers continued to return marked with red ink and disappointing grades. The pattern was always the same. His practical insights dismissed as anecdotal, his real-world observations labeled as lacking theoretical foundation. "Hey, Marcus," called Jenny Chen, a 19-year-old political science major who had started sitting near him during their study sessions. "Want to form a study group for Morrison's class? Maybe we can figure out what she wants." Marcus looked up from his notes on nation-building strategies, notes that drew from first-hand experience watching governments rise and fall. "Sure, Jenny, that'd be helpful." The study group that formed around their table included Tommy Rodriguez, a recent high school graduate with dreams of joining the State Department, and Sarah Williams, a single mother returning to school after her divorce. They were good kids, Marcus thought, earnest and hardworking, even if they didn't understand that the world was far more complicated than their textbooks suggested. "I don't get why she marked down my paper on diplomatic immunity," Tommy complained, pulling out his graded assignment. "I cited everything properly." Marcus glanced at the paper's thesis, a straightforward regurgitation of legal principles with no consideration of how those principles played out in practice. In places like Kabul or Baghdad, diplomatic immunity was often the only thing standing between an operative and a very unpleasant death. But it also created moral gray areas that no academic paper could adequately address. "Maybe she wants more critical analysis," Marcus suggested carefully, "not just what the law says, but how it actually works in different situations." "But that's speculation," Sarah protested. "She always says she wants facts, not opinions." Marcus bit back his response. In his experience, the most important facts were often the ones that couldn't be cited in academic journals, the unspoken understandings, the cultural nuances that determined whether a mission succeeded or failed. But how could he explain that without revealing information that was still classified? Professor Morrison's voice echoed from across the library as she led a group of her graduate assistants to a nearby table. "The problem with non-traditional students," she was saying, her voice carrying further than she probably intended, "is that they often confuse life experience with academic knowledge. They think working various jobs gives them expertise in complex geopolitical matters. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, not anger, but the controlled frustration of someone who had learned to swallow injustice as part of the job. His various jobs had included gathering intelligence on terrorist networks, negotiating the release of American hostages, and providing security assessments that helped prevent attacks on U.S. soil. But his official transcripts listed only his Army service and a series of government contractor positions with deliberately vague job descriptions. "Don't listen to her," Jenny whispered, having overheard the professor's comment. "She doesn't know anything about your background." That was precisely the problem, Marcus realized. His background was his greatest asset and his biggest liability. The skills that had made him valuable to his country, the ability to blend in, to appear unremarkable, to hide his true capabilities, now worked against him in an environment that valued credentials over competence. The next morning brought another disappointing grade on his paper about intelligence failures. Professor Morrison had written extensive comments questioning his unsupported claims about the importance of human intelligence over technological surveillance. Marcus stared at the feedback, remembering nights spent in hostile territory where human intelligence, a trusted local contact, a carefully cultivated relationship, had meant the difference between mission success and American casualties. After class, he approached Professor Morrison's desk once more. "I was wondering if we could discuss my paper. I think there might be some miscommunication about." "Mr. Thompson," she interrupted, not looking up from her computer, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you need to understand that personal beliefs and assumptions don't constitute academic argument. This is a rigorous academic program, not a venue for sharing war stories or conspiracy theories." The words hit harder than she probably intended. War stories. If only she knew that his stories were actually after-action reports that had helped shape American foreign policy for 2 decades. "I understand," Marcus replied quietly. "Thank you for your time." Walking across campus that afternoon, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. His GPA was suffering, and at his age, he couldn't afford to fail courses and extend his time in school. His wife, Linda, was already making sacrifices to support his education, working extra shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. But something deeper than grades was at stake. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt truly invisible, not by design, but by dismissal. The skills that had once made him indispensable now seemed worthless in a world that valued theoretical knowledge over practical wisdom. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Linda, it's me. I'm thinking about dropping the Morrison class." "Marcus Thompson," his wife's voice came through with that mixture of love and steel that had kept him grounded through 23 years of marriage. "I didn't marry a quitter. You've faced worse than one stubborn professor." She was right, of course, but those previous battles had been fought in shadows, where his victories remained forever unacknowledged. This time, he was fighting in broad daylight, and losing publicly felt like a different kind of defeat entirely. The October rain drummed against the windows of Professor Morrison's classroom as she handed back the latest batch of papers. Marcus watched the stack diminish, knowing his would be among the last. It always was, as if she saved the disappointing grades for the end. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of his younger classmates, most of whom wore expressions of satisfaction as they received their papers. When his turn came, Marcus saw the grade before Professor Morrison even placed it on his desk. Not a D this time, but a complete failure. The red ink seemed to blade across the title page of his analysis on the role of cultural intelligence in counterterrorism operations. "See me after class," Professor Morrison said quietly, her tone suggesting this would not be a pleasant conversation. Marcus barely heard the rest of the lecture. He stared at the comments scrawled across his paper. "Unsubstantiated claims, lacks proper citations, reads like fiction rather than academic analysis." The irony wasn't lost on him. She was criticizing him for writing fiction when he was drawing from classified operations that had saved American lives. When the classroom emptied, Marcus approached her desk with the careful composure he'd learned in hostile interrogations. Professor Morrison looked up from her laptop, her expression a mixture of frustration and what might have been pity. "Mr. Thompson, I think we need to have an honest conversation about your academic performance," she began, removing her glasses and setting them on the desk. "You're currently failing this course, and based on your work so far, I don't see that changing." Marcus remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, a posture that had become second nature during decades of military briefings. "I'd like to understand what I'm doing wrong. I've read every assignment, attended every class, and spent hours on each paper." Professor Morrison sighed, leaning back in her chair. "The issue isn't your effort, Marcus, it's your approach. You consistently make claims about intelligence operations and international relations that sound like they come from Hollywood movies rather than academic sources. Academic writing requires proper citations, peer-reviewed sources, and theoretical frameworks. What if the sources can't be cited?" Marcus asked quietly. "Then they're not valid for academic purposes," she replied immediately. "Look, I understand you served in the military, and I respect that service. But military experience, even overseas deployment, doesn't qualify someone to make authoritative statements about complex geopolitical operations." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, not anger, but a profound weariness. What kind of qualifications would qualify someone to make those statements? Advanced degrees in international relations, political science, or related fields? Extensive research using proper methodologies? Published work in peer-reviewed journals? The kind of credentials that demonstrate serious academic engagement with these topics. The November rain had intensified, creating a steady drumbeat against the windows that matched the pulse in Marcus's temples. He thought about the qualifications she'd mentioned, the advanced degrees he'd never had time to earn, while he was busy preventing the kind of international incidents she only read about in journals. "I see," Marcus said finally. "And there's no possibility of extra credit, additional assignments to improve my grade?" Professor Morrison shook her head. "At this point, even perfect scores on the remaining assignments wouldn't bring you to a passing grade. I'd recommend withdrawing from the course before the deadline. Take some time to develop better academic writing skills, maybe start with some introductory courses, and then consider retaking this class next year." The suggestion hit Marcus like a physical blow. Start with introductory courses. Next year, at 52, with a wife working double shifts to support his education, time was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I appreciate your honesty," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Walking across campus in the rain, Marcus felt the weight of more than just academic failure. For 23 years, his work had mattered, lives saved, disasters averted, national security protected. Now his decades of expertise were being dismissed by someone who had never left the safety of academia. He found himself in the campus parking lot, standing next to his 15-year-old Ford pickup truck, another mark against him in Professor Morrison's eyes, no doubt. The rain soaked through his flannel shirt, but he didn't move to get in the truck. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in months. "Richardson." "Jack, it's Marcus Thompson." A pause, then recognition. "Jesus, Marcus, how long has it been? I heard you were going to school. How's civilian life treating you?" Jack Richardson had been Marcus's handler during his final 5 years with the agency. They'd worked together on operations across 3 continents, and Jack was one of the few people who knew the full scope of Marcus's service record. "It's challenging," Marcus said, watching students hurry past through the rain. "Jack, I need to ask you something. If someone needed to verify my service record, not the classified details, but the general scope of my work, who would they contact?" "Well, that's complicated. Most of your file is still under seal, probably will be for another decade at least. But if someone had legitimate need to know, they could contact the Office of Personnel Security at Langley." "Why? You having trouble with background checks?" Marcus almost laughed at the understatement. Something like that. Listen, Marcus, if you're having problems, I might be able to make some calls. You were one of the best operatives I ever worked with. 23 years of exemplary service, commendations from 3 different directors. That should count for something. Thanks, Jack. I'll keep that in mind. Marcus ended the call and finally got into his truck. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and he sat for a moment watching the rain streak down his windshield. He had a decision to make. Withdraw from the course, as Professor Morrison suggested, or find another way to prove that experience sometimes mattered more than credentials. That evening, Linda found him at their kitchen table, staring at the withdrawal form he'd printed from the college website. She set down a cup of coffee beside him and took the seat across from him, the same seat where she'd encouraged him to enroll in college, where she'd helped him fill out financial aid forms, where she'd listened to his frustrations about feeling out of place among students young enough to be their children. "Tell me what happened," she said simply. Marcus told her everything: the failed grades, Professor Morrison's dismissive comments, the suggestion that he wasn't qualified to discuss subjects he'd lived for 2 decades. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more determined with each detail. "Marcus Thompson," she said when he finished, "I've been married to you for 23 years. I've seen you come home from places you couldn't name, carrying burdens you couldn't share. I've watched you sacrifice your own recognition so that other people could sleep safely. And now some professor who's never left her classroom is going to tell you that your life's work doesn't matter." She reached across the table and pulled the withdrawal form toward her, then tore it in half. "You're not quitting. And if she can't see your value, then maybe it's time someone else did." Dean Patricia Williams had served in academic administration for over 15 years, but she'd never received a complaint quite like the one sitting on her desk Monday morning. Linda Thompson's letter was respectful but firm, requesting a review of her husband's treatment in Professor Morrison's International Relations course. What caught the dean's attention wasn't the complaint itself. Grade disputes were common, but the subtle references to relevant professional experience and service-connected qualifications that suggested there might be more to this story. Dean Williams had learned to read between the lines during her previous career as a Navy intelligence officer before transitioning to academia. Something in Linda Thompson's carefully worded letter triggered her instincts. "Sarah," she called to her assistant, "can you pull Marcus Thompson's complete academic file and see if you can get his military records from the registrar's office?" An hour later, Dean Williams sat reviewing the sparse documentation of Marcus Thompson's background. His military service record showed 23 years in the Army, honorable discharge with the rank of Sergeant First Class, and a series of commendations with redacted details. His post-military employment history listed work with various government contractors, companies Dean Williams recognized as CIA front organizations. Her phone buzzed with an internal call. "Dean Williams, this is Professor Morrison. I understand there's been a complaint filed regarding one of my students." "Helen, yes, I'm reviewing the situation now. Can you tell me about Marcus Thompson's performance in your class?" Professor Morrison's voice carried a note of frustration. "He's a classic case of a non-traditional student who's struggling with academic rigor. His papers read like personal narratives rather than scholarly analysis. He makes claims about intelligence operations and international affairs that are completely unsupported by proper academic sources." "What kind of claims?" "Oh, detailed descriptions of interrogation techniques, assertions about the effectiveness of human intelligence versus technological surveillance, critiques of academic theories based on what he calls real-world experience. It's clear he's either read too many spy novels or he's confused his military service with expertise in international intelligence operations." Dean Williams made notes as Professor Morrison spoke, but her instincts were telling her a different story. "Helen, I'm going to conduct a formal review of this situation. In the meantime, I'd like you to suspend any final grade determinations for Mr. Thompson. After ending the call, Dean Williams spent the rest of the morning making discreet inquiries. Her contacts in the intelligence community were limited, but she still maintained relationships from her Navy days. By afternoon, she had a phone number for someone who might be able to provide clarity. Office of Personnel Security, this is Director Harrison. Director Harrison, this is Dean Patricia Williams from Riverside Community College. I'm calling about a former employee who's currently enrolled as a student. I need to verify the scope of his service for academic purposes. I'll need the individual's full name, social security number, and your official request in writing before I can. The name is Marcus Thompson, and I believe he worked under your oversight until approximately 18 months ago. A long pause. Dean Williams, I'm going to transfer you to my supervisor. Please hold. The next voice that came on the line was older, more cautious. Dean Williams, this is Associate Director Coleman. I understand you're inquiring about Marcus Thompson. Yes, sir, I have a student whose academic performance is being questioned, but I have reason to believe there may be relevant professional experience that's not reflected in his official transcripts. Dean Williams, can you tell me why Marcus is having academic difficulties? The question surprised her. It suggested familiarity with the individual in question. His professor believes he's making unsupported claims about intelligence operations and international affairs. She says his analyses sound like fiction rather than scholarly work. A dry chuckle came through the phone. I see. Dean Williams, I can't discuss classified information, but I can tell you that Marcus Thompson served with distinction in several capacities during his government career. If you could email me the specific academic areas where his knowledge is being questioned, I might be able to provide some general guidance about his qualifications. That afternoon, Dean Williams sent a carefully worded email outlining the topics covered in Professor Morrison's course and the specific areas where Marcus's work had been criticized. The response came back within 2 hours. Dean Williams, without revealing classified information, I can confirm that Mr. Thompson has extensive professional experience in all the areas you've mentioned. His expertise in human intelligence operations, cultural analysis, and counterterrorism activities is based on 2 decades of fieldwork in hostile environments. While I cannot provide specific details, I can tell you that his insights into these matters would be considered authoritative by professionals in the field. He has received commendations from 3 CIA directors and has been instrumental in operations that have saved American lives and protected national security interests. Dean Williams stared at the email, reading it twice to make sure she understood its implications. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a veteran struggling with academic requirements. He was a highly decorated intelligence operative whose unsupported claims were based on classified operations that couldn't be cited in academic papers. The next morning, she called Professor Morrison to her office. Helen Morrison arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, her expression suggesting she expected to discuss the difficult student who had complained about his grades. Helen, sit down. We need to talk about Marcus Thompson. Dean Williams, I hope you understand that I can't compromise academic standards just because a student complains about his grades. His work simply doesn't meet collegiate-level requirements. Dean Williams slid a printed email across her desk, the response from Associate Director Coleman, with the sender's identification carefully visible at the top. Helen, I need you to read this very carefully. She watched Professor Morrison's expression change as she read, color draining from her face as the implications became clear. I don't understand. Are you saying he actually worked for the CIA? I'm saying that the man you've been treating as an unqualified, non-traditional student has spent over 2 decades protecting American interests in ways that are still classified. His unsupported claims about intelligence operations are based on operations he personally conducted. Professor Morrison set down the email with trembling hands, but he never said, He never mentioned. Helen, people who work in intelligence don't generally advertise their backgrounds. They're trained to blend in, to appear unremarkable. Marcus Thompson has been doing exactly what he was trained to do, keeping his mouth shut about classified information while trying to earn a degree. The silence in the office stretched for nearly a minute before Professor Morrison spoke again. "What do you want me to do?" Dean Williams leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "I want you to reevaluate your assumptions about what qualifies someone to discuss international affairs. And I want you to find a way to recognize experience alongside academic theory. Some of your students might know more than their textbooks can teach them." That afternoon, Dean Williams made one more phone call, this time to Marcus Thompson himself. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dean Williams from the college. I wonder if you could come to my office tomorrow morning. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your academic goals." Marcus Thompson walked into Dean Williams' office the next morning, expecting another discussion about his academic struggles. Instead, he found himself facing a woman whose bearing and direct gaze immediately reminded him of the military intelligence officers he'd worked with overseas. Her office was decorated with naval memorabilia, and a photo on her desk showed her in Navy dress uniform receiving some kind of commendation. "Mr. Thompson, please sit down. I believe we have more in common than you might expect." Dean Williams gestured to the chair across from her desk, and Marcus noticed the careful way she observed him, not the dismissive glance he'd grown accustomed to from Professor Morrison, but the analytical assessment of someone trained to evaluate people quickly and accurately. "I served as a Navy intelligence officer before transitioning to academia," she began without preamble. "Yesterday, I had some very interesting conversations about your background." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with potential security breaches. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you might have heard, but—" "Relax, Mr. Thompson. I followed proper channels and observed all security protocols. But I think it's time someone recognized that your academic difficulties might stem from knowing too much rather than too little." She slid a folder across her desk. Inside was Marcus's academic file, along with printouts of his failed papers and Professor Morrison's comments. But attached to the front was a letter on CIA letterhead, not the classified communication she'd received, but an official academic reference letter. "Read this," Dean Williams said simply. Marcus opened the letter and immediately recognized the signature, Associate Director Coleman, his former supervisor's supervisor. The letter was carefully worded to avoid classified information, but it provided a clear picture of Marcus's qualifications. Mr. Marcus Thompson served with distinction in various capacities within the U.S. intelligence community for 23 years. His expertise includes human intelligence operations, cultural analysis, counterterrorism activities, and international security assessments. He has worked extensively in hostile environments across multiple continents and has been recognized for his contributions to American national security. His practical knowledge of intelligence operations and international affairs is based on direct professional experience at the highest levels of government service. Marcus looked up from the letter to find Dean Williams watching him with an expression of profound respect. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. This institution failed to recognize the value you bring to our academic community." "It's not your fault, ma'am. The system works the way it's supposed to work. I knew coming in that my background couldn't be properly documented." "Perhaps not, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it entirely." Dean Williams pulled out another document, a formal academic accommodation form. "I'm implementing a new policy for students with relevant professional experience in specialized fields. It allows for alternative assessment methods that recognize practical expertise alongside academic theory." Marcus stared at the form, hardly believing what he was reading. "What does this mean, practically speaking?" "It means that instead of being penalized for drawing on your professional experience, you'll be encouraged to integrate it with academic theory. Your papers will be evaluated by a panel that includes both academic faculty and professionals from relevant fields. And it means Professor Morrison will need to reconsider her assessment of your work. That afternoon, Marcus returned to Professor Morrison's classroom for what he assumed would be another uncomfortable encounter. Instead, he found her waiting with a completely different demeanor. Her usual academic confidence had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment. "Mr. Thompson," she began as the other students filed out after class, "I owe you a significant apology. I've learned about your professional background, and I realize I've been unfair in my assessments." Marcus remained standing, unsure how to navigate this reversal. "Professor Morrison, you were working with the information you had. I understand that." "No, it goes deeper than that. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your appearance and your age. I dismissed your insights because they didn't fit my preconceptions about academic discourse." She pulled out his graded papers, the ones marked with red ink and failing grades. "I've been reviewing your work with new perspective, and I realized that what I criticized as unsupported claims were actually expert analyses that I wasn't qualified to evaluate." She handed him a new grade sheet. Instead of the F he'd been carrying, he now saw a B+. "This reflects the actual quality of your work, evaluated by someone who understands its context." Marcus looked at the grade, but found himself thinking less about the academic recognition than about the broader implications. "Professor Morrison, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How many other students do you think you might be underestimating? People who bring different kinds of experience to your classroom?" The question visibly struck her. I don't know. I've never really considered that possibility. Maybe it's worth considering now." 3 months later, Marcus Thompson graduated with honors from Riverside Community College's International Relations program. His final paper, "The Integration of Academic Theory and Operational Experience in Intelligence Analysis," became required reading for the department and was later published in a national security journal. But more importantly, his experience led to the creation of the college's Professional Experience Recognition Program, which is